now the go live is there.
So I'll select it.
So if you want more than one person, are you a student? Where you go? Oh, did you your teacher tell you to come?
Yeah, but
Oh, you want?
yeah, kind of, sort of, but not really. Yeah.
Sure. What's your name?
Thank you. Now you were a teacher around here, right? No, no. Never at all, right? Thank you. Yeah.
Do you know if he tested if
Now you just walked in the room. What were you gonna ask me?
did you see if the check was a quicker thing?
No. I think he was playing with it, but I wasn't watching him.
There's five different books. Yeah, this is the first book I ever wrote. This is 3 years old. This is on the war in the Pacific.
There are two other people watching.
They're all narrative comics.
I wonder if my wife is. I told her about it. She might be. She could be.
Guys who were in the heavy bombers over Europe. More guys who were POWs, in the heavy bombers.
Are you in line?
Am I? Nope. I am standing here taking care of the technology. She isn't either, so you go help yourself.
They actually, I feel like I'm interrupting that.
Martyr down the resistance.
Yeah, we can do this at the end too. No,
That picture was in an article.
sister Diane.
Oh, I think have I met you before?
You might have. I've heard about it. Well, no, you're going to say hi. Okay.
These are all signed too.
You can write these books, you can try,
Exactly. If you can do the research behind this. And I probably will grab a bag. I bought everybody. How are you? I bought everybody that we could go some more. More?
Okay, so 80 plus
1, 2, 3, 4. And then. Right?
65 plus 80 as well.
The 5 special is one of each of them. I don't think that I'm thinking of it.
Oh yeah, he gave me a
Oh, that was the one you returned. You gave it to Marvin. Oh, we did a couple of those. Is that the client? No, is that your own?
Welcome. And then you know, when you get a chance to grab my. Do you have a bag, by the way, you said? And thanks for today. I hope you'll come back. I did not. So I would appreciate if you just wanted to sign a couple. You can do those afterwards if you want. Oh, they already are. Fantastic.
You can pass it on.
Thank you.
We're going to start the program, so Yep. Still sign up. Lily. Right up. Texas. When they come.
Thanks again for wonderful
You
dinner.
take them to your house, and they won't even take the Texas. They won't take them to.
Oh, is it great?
Yeah, they
It was here. I did.
Goodwill, they won't take Texas.
People remember that.
Did I have? Yeah, they'll take everything.
No, I
They'll
didn't
tell
get
you,
along.
take the facts and everything. They won't take, they won't take, Texas. This is outdated. Up to you.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. Some of you I've not yet met. I'm Sarah Clark. I'm the new director here, so I'm really happy to see a full house here tonight. Matthew Rozell spoke earlier today at Mohonasen High School. Some of us were lucky enough to see this, and we know what a treat you have tonight. This is a really special program, really special story, and I hope you enjoy.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Voorheesville Public Library. It is our pleasure to have Matthew Rozell return to our library. He was here 3 years ago. Mr. Rozell is an award-winning retired history teacher, author, speaker, and blogger on the topic of the most cataclysmic events in the history of mankind, World War II and the Holocaust. Mr. Rozell has earned praise for his teaching and research, has been featured as the ABC World News Person of the Week, and has had his work as a teacher filmed for the CBS Evening News, NBC Learn, the Israeli Broadcast Authority, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the New York State United Teachers. As the founder of the World War II Living History Project, Mr. Rozell and his students recorded the testimony of hundreds from the World War II generation. One of his interviews and his dogged pursuit thereafter led to the reuniting of a train transport of Holocaust survivors with their actual American liberators over 60 years later, and the discovery of one of the most iconic photographs of the Holocaust. It's right here. This evening, Mr. Rozell will share this incredibly important story, which he chronicles in his book, A Train Near Magdeburg, and he will be selling books at the end of the program. I think Mr. Rozell would agree with me that the stories of World War II and the Holocaust cannot be forgotten. The past should be a mandate for the future. So I'll give him a very warm welcome.
Good evening. My name is Matthew Rozell, as Gail just told you. I'm going to tell you some stories tonight. I hope I don't put anybody to sleep. I think I did okay this afternoon or this morning. Thank you. My #1 fan in the front row. No, Diane, she set everything up at Mahonison. She did a great amount of work to bring a day of remembrance to the students at Mahonison High School. I know how much hard work it takes. It was the entire school day. And by the time I got to the school and did my thing, it was noon. And the kids were still with it. They were still on task. They were into it. And I think it's really important for our young people especially to take some time out to think about the way the world was 3 generations ago, 3 lifetimes ago. For them, it could be ancient history. And that's why this story in particular is so important for our young people, and for adults as well, because it reminds us of the common heritage that we have as Americans in times that sometimes we can get pretty down on ourselves, current events, whatever. But if we look back and we can see just what created the character of these American soldiers who stumbled upon the greatest crime in the history of the world with really no foreknowledge about it. So I'm going to tell you the story about these 2 gentlemen in the photograph and what they told me and what resulted because of that. So, as Gail mentioned, I do have a blog. It's at the bottom. It's called teachinghistorymatters.com. I actually started it in 2007. Today I do have one of my former students in the front row. Aaron, what year did you graduate from HF?
95.
95. Okay, see, I would have placed him 2005. You look so young today. However, I guess my whole point is when Aaron was there in 95, that's about the time I started this thing I called the World War II Living History Project. And when we began to study World War II, it's something that these kids have to take, these mandated state exams. The class that I think I had Aaron in was global studies at the time, global history, where 9th and 10th grade, I had to teach these young people 8,000 years of world history in 180 days. You know, a 42-minute class period. By the time you get the kids settled down and ready to do something, there's 20 minutes left. And there was a big disconnect because by the time you got to World War II, you were cramming and you were jamming. It was this time of the year in the school curriculum. And you had to get through the rest of history, because history doesn't stop. It keeps going on, and you have to teach all of it. My point is, I just kind of paused out, like around this time of the year when things get so stressful. And I said, you know what, we're going to spend more than just the 2 or 3 class periods going over World War II. And I used to just pause, and I would say, how many of you had a father or a grandfather or an aunt or an uncle who had, was involved in some way in World War II? Every single kid would put their hand up, okay? Usually when I ask it to high school kids today, you get a scattering of hands that go up because they're gone now, okay? They haven't heard these stories firsthand. But I saw a spark there, and I made up this silly survey. It was only 2 pages long, and I said, take this home, and I bribed the kids with extra credit. Get your grandpa or your grandmother or your aunt or your uncle to fill this thing in, because I want to know where they were and what they did. And if they have any words of wisdom for your generation. And I can remember distinctly one of the surveys that I got back, in this old man, scraggly, caps lock handwriting, he said, I don't know how you could make anybody understand a nightmare like a World War II. And that was the whole sentence he wrote. Okay? So, what did I do? Did I throw it in the drawer? No, I called them up. And I began to have these veterans come into the classroom. And some of these guys had never spoken about their war experience outside of their own buddies at reunions or whatever. Even their own wives, their kids certainly didn't know anything about it. But when the grandchild generation began to ask those questions, that's when they began to open up a little bit and talk. So that's in a nutshell how my project began, and I really saw a spark with these young people and to connect them with the elder generation. It was a two-way thing. The elder generation got a lot out of this encounter too. And thankfully that's been modeled in a lot of schools around here. Oral history is really a good way to put your students' population in touch with, you know, what really happened. And to make a continuity, we began to put these interviews on the World Wide Web about 3 years after you graduated in '98. I literally would have the kids take VHS videotapes of the interviews that I did or they did. I'd have them type them out on the computer, so they would literally be hitting the pause button on their family VCR. And I don't know what they were typing on back in those days, but they would give me a transcript, which we would then clean up, edit, and make sure it read right, and we put them on our school website. So I had about 20 of those stories up. And one day, one of my students, actually it was his father, who said, you should interview Sean's grandfather. He's coming to Hudson Falls for the summer. And he was a tank commander in World War II after the Normandy landings. He fought for 10 months in combat all the way through the end of the war in May 1945. And this is him right here. His name was Carol Walsh, originally from Johnstown, New York. Carol was 22 or 23 when he landed in Europe. He was 24 when the war ended, and when he had this encounter that I'm going to tell you about tonight. I spoke to him for several hours, actually 2 hours on a summer morning, and the entire time he was very animated. He was telling me nightmare story after nightmare story, but he also told me funny stories about the guys he was with. He was laughing like crazy, slapping his leg, just the jokes they would play on each other, and then the terror of combat, you know, the next minute. He did not even mention this photograph or the story I'm going to tell you tonight until his daughter said, Dad, did you tell Mr. Rozell about that train? I mean, I was literally shutting the camera off to go home. And he said, wait, okay, I'll tell you the story. And the story involves his good buddy here, George Crouse. In this photograph, it's near the end of the war, and they're all smiles. But when they were together in a single tank shortly after D-Day, the Normandy landings, of which the 75th anniversary is this June, they hated each other's guts. Okay, Sherman tank, inside of a light tank like theirs, there's not a lot of room to maneuver. And there were 4 or 5 guys, 4 I think in his tank. These 2 guys were stuck in some of the heaviest combat in Western Europe. And they didn't get along. It was actually kind of funny to listen to it. And I wrote about it in the book too. Red hated the Army. He was totally, did not like anything to do. He just wasn't an Army guy. George was a by-the-book Army guy. His father was as well. George lived in California. He was from upstate New York. Like I said, they clashed. But by the end of the war, they were close friends. So, in this storytelling, Red Walsh was in his rocking chair at age 80. He said, you should get a hold of my friend George, because on this one day in April 1945, my tank and his tank. By now they were both their own. They won battlefield commissions and they commanded their own tanks. He said, we were told to go investigate this train that was stopped by the Elbe River. It was just stopped there, and there were people milling about. And talked to him because he took pictures. Okay, so, next slide. Oh, I forgot to tell you about me. That's what happens when you get carried away. This is my last class at Hudson Falls High School in June 2017. They were great kids. I love them. I'm writing my 6th book. I got 5 of them up here. I'll tell you about them later. You can buy them if you want. I was a United States Holocaust Memorial Museum teacher fellow. A lot of it had to do with this project that I'm doing. The Organization of American Historians, which is national, picked me as their history teacher of the year for American history. That was cool. I toured Europe with this group, Holocaust and Jewish Resistance Teachers Program. It was a tour that took me to all the places that I needed to visit for my book. It was very profound. There were about 30 teachers. New York State Education Department gave me their highest award for teaching the Holocaust and human rights. And I got to meet the Commissioner of Education. I got to sit in her chair in the boardroom down at the Board of Regents. And I dropped a couple hints about what I thought about the mandated state exams.
Thank you.
Oh, I think they got it. Didn't do any good. But, I went to Yad Vashem, which is in Jerusalem. It's the Israeli Holocaust Authority. And
Keep talking.
yeah,
You have a loud voice.
for 3 weeks I studied the Holocaust with the top scholars in the world. And I'll tell you what, every time, I don't care what subject you talk about, but especially the Holocaust, I think, every time you think you know it all, you realize how much you don't know. I learned a lot from these people. Oh, and one of the highest awards I really prized was when the Greater Glens Falls Jewish community gave me, they planted a tree in my honor in my hometown. And my hometown is Hudson Falls, New York, where I taught history to Aaron and Kayla and others with my friend Doreen, my colleague back there. Hudson Falls is the community I grew up in, and when I was 18 years old, I can remember distinctly driving down to Main Street in Hudson Falls with my dad. He picked me up from school. He was a Hudson Falls graduate as well. He was a history teacher in Glens Falls. And he said, so, son, what do you want to do with your life? I was 18, senior, springtime, ready to bowl. I said, I don't know, but I know I'm not going to be a teacher. I think I was twisting a knife in his back a little bit. And I said, and I'm getting out of Hudson Falls, I'll never come back. 7 years later, I was driving his old junk car around town, living under his roof in the garage, driving up the street to Hudson Falls High School, where I was on the other side of the desk as a teacher, and that's where I was for 30 years. So the town that I said I would never go back to, watch what you say, because this group put this monument in my village park. It's a tree planted in my honor, and this monument was given to me, and it's a pretty moving thing. This was last May. Unfortunately, everybody thinks I'm buried under it. It's true. Okay, back to the story. Okay, it's springtime. It's right about the time of the year right now. The flowers are blooming. The birds are singing. The snow is going away. The days are getting longer. And the first American soldiers begin to stumble upon this thing that we now call the Holocaust. There was no word for it back in 1945. The first camp that was entered, I believe it was April 4th. It was a sub-camp of Buchenwald. Buchenwald was a major camp. It's where Elie Wiesel was liberated. Of course, his father had died shortly beforehand. On April 12th, the Supreme Allied Commander visited Ordruff, and he brought with him General Patton, General Bradley, a lot of the top brass, because they wanted to see for themselves. And he made an impromptu speech. He said, "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least he knows what he is fighting against." Okay, the Supreme Allied commander was? It was Ike. It was General Eisenhower. And this photograph shows him touring Buchenwald. He's pacing in the front row there, and some of the bodies, which is just a tiny, tiny amount of what they saw that day. General Patton went around the corner, Mr. Tough Guy, blood and guts, and he threw up. The next day, on April 13th, these two tanks rolled up to this train, and they saw something beyond comprehension. Their Major Clarence Benjamin, was in a Jeep. He said Gross and Walsh, Tank 12 and Tank 13 and the 740, you guys come with me. There are another 18 tanks in the small battalion. A light tank battalion can move very fast. They worked in tandem with the 30th Infantry Division, foot soldier infantry. They were like the spearheads. So they were going fast and furious towards the Elbe River. They had a final battle to fight at the city of Magdeburg a couple days after this photograph was taken. But Major Benjamin pulled up in a Jeep. He stood up. He pulled out his camera and he snapped this photograph just as these people started streaming up the hill towards his Jeep, realizing that they have now been saved. They were concentration camp victims, refugees from the camp Bergen-Belsen. They had left Bergen-Belsen a week before. The train had only traveled 60 or 70 miles, but it was stop and start. It was back and forth. The tracks were blown out here. Many people died on this journey. There were 2,500 people alive when they pulled up to this train. Now, I always tell the young people in the audience especially, look at the girl. Look at the little girl in the front. There were about 500 children on this train. There were families on this train. There were Jews from all across Europe. Look at her face. Do you see joy in her face? No, what do you see? You see sheer terror. And I speculate, and you see she's looking off a little bit. She sees those two tanks rolling up behind the Jeep. These two monsters clanking. These women see the white star on it, and they know they're saved. So, his daughter said, "Did you tell him about the train?" He said, "No, I didn't." And he kept rocking in his chair. This is Red Walsh. He said, "Well, late in the war, he started to tell me the story." Now, his tank was only there for 1 hour. Maybe that's one of the reasons it didn't come to his mind when he was telling me all of his battle stories. It just didn't register that high. It would later. He said, "Talk to my friend George in California," because he had a camera too, and he took other photos. The photo that Clarence Benjamin took, the Major, got stuck in an official after-action report every day. You may or may not be aware, any battalion, any regiment, they would file these things called after-action reports, which is kind of like the daily diary of what happened. And you don't usually see too much color in it. They don't get too dramatic in it. But he pasted this photograph in. Nobody ever did that. And it got filed into the National Archives. Nobody ever saw it again until I had this conversation with Red Walsh. And he had a copy of it. So did Dr. Gross. And it says, the photograph inserted below was taken by Major Benjamin. The moment the first of the refugees of the train became aware that their liberation, they start to move up the hill towards the train. There were 12 German military guards, including the train commander, who gave up without a fight when they saw our tanks. There were 2,500 pitiable, oppressed people from all over Europe, starved, beaten, ill, some dying, but all of whom were wildly happy and grateful to their quote-unquote liberators. The tank crew passed out what food and cigarettes they could to help the sufferers, and then he goes on for a couple more paragraphs, and then it's on to the next day, what happened on April 14th. Here are the photographs that George Gross took. You see families. You see people up on a hill reclining. George Gross said 16 of those people died in the 24 hours that his tank was with them. His tank was ordered to stay there to protect it overnight in case the Germans came back. You see kids. These girls were literally ready to pass out, starved. This woman, we know her name. Her name is Gina Rappaport. She translated for George Gross. This is his tank. She spoke English. She was from the Krakow ghetto in Poland. There's a captured German soldier. So, I got permission to put the story on the website. I got permission to put Dr. Gross's photographs. He became a professor of English literature. I don't remember if I told you, but Red Walsh became a New York State Supreme Court justice. So these are guys that did something with their lives afterwards. And he gave me permission to put them on the school website, Hudson Falls World War II Living History Project. And 4 years after I put them up, I got an email from Australia. This woman was a 7-year-old girl on the train, and I remember telling you, Doreen, you and Greg Parch, in the lunchroom, I was so astounded. This lady emailed me and said, I fell out of my chair, I started to scream, I saw the photographs the day that I was liberated. Now, she was a 7-year-old girl. She didn't remember very much about that day. She remembered that one of the German guards dropped a rifle and she picked it up because she wanted to shoot. And her parents yanked it out of her hands. They all survived, thank God. And they made their way to Australia, where she lives today. And she was able to connect with those 2 soldiers. So that was pretty cool. That was in the spring of 2006. That's how long ago it was. So great. Well, next thing you know, I get emails from 3 more guys, like boom, boom, boom. And in the fall of 2007, I said, you know what? Red Walsh is in Hudson Falls. He'd go to Florida for the winter. I said, he's hanging out at his daughter's house. Let's get some of these guys to come up to Hudson Falls High School. Dr. Peter Lantos is a world-renowned neurosurgeon, a brain surgeon from King's College in London. He was a 6-year-old Hungarian boy on the train. His father died in Bergen-Belsen. Dr. Mika Tomkowitz is a physicist and a climate change scientist. He is down in Brooklyn at Brooklyn College. His father also died in Bergen-Belsen. In other words, their mom survived to take care of him. Fred Spiegel, very interesting. He was in Bergen-Belsen with his sister. They were from Germany. They got out of Germany shortly after Kristallnacht, went to Holland, and that's where they were rounded up by the Germans. They came up, he was from New Jersey, and they met Red Walsh on a nice fall afternoon in 2007 at our high school. They talked in front of the students, they all gave testimony. I contacted the press and let them know it was going to be happening. The next morning, everybody went their merry way. It was a Saturday. I remember it was raining, pouring hard, but I was like on top of the world that we were able to pull this thing off, and so many students got to witness this. I went shopping for a new computer at Staples. And you know, when you go shopping for a new computer at any big box store, the next thing they try to sell you is the monitor, even though you don't need it. So the salesman turns on this monitor, and this was on the screen. I said, oh my goodness, that's my classroom. That's Red Walsh, and this is all over the world. It literally went viral. By the time Monday morning came around, my school email had 60 new survivors from all over the world. Israel, Florida, Canada, England, who had been children on this train because it was a big story. And so many people tried to download the photographs on the school website, like 20,000 times. They crashed the servers on Sunday. It was pretty exciting. Anyway, fast forward, that was in 2007. Fast forward, what, 12, 13 years? We've reunited reunited about 275 of these children. We hosted 3 reunions at our high school. The last one was in 2011. We had 11 reunions overall, many of them in the South, because a lot of these survivors were invited to travel to the Old Soldiers Reunion, the 30th Infantry Division. 3 continents. I wrote the book because I had to. It took me 10 years to write it. And it's going to be a PBS documentary next spring. So, Gail sent an email out to everybody, and she'll tell you to vote for it or something, so that it gets on there. It's not done yet. Okay, anyway, it took me 10 years to write the book. I knew I had to write a book, so I saved every scrap of information. And I knew I had to answer some questions, and I'm just going to throw a couple of the questions that I had to figure out how I was going to bring them into this book. What is the book about, first and foremost? The book has 4 parts. The first part is about the Holocaust, the greatest crime in the history of the world. It says, how many people were murdered in the Holocaust? Well, what's the number? What do you think? I mean, what have you heard? Anybody? How many? 10 million is close. They say 11 million. How many Jewish people? They say 6. Now, here's a question that they threw out at me when I studied the Yad Vashem. A 90-year-old historian threw out to me, he said, how do you know those numbers are accurate? Where did you get the 6 million number? Where did you get the 11 million number? The answer is, there's all kinds of sources that you have to draw from. But one of the things I always think about, because Holocaust deniers are always coming at you with this stuff. I get hit with them by them a lot. You know what? Yad Vashem has only counted 4.5 million. It doesn't mean the people aren't there. It means these people are still being counted every single day, as far as Jewish people, okay? The other 5 million, you think, well, who were they? Political prisoners. They were also the homosexual population, the Roma/Gypsy population, okay? Other undesirables. Okay, their numbers are kind of tiny when you compare it to the Jewish population. And that's a whole other thing to talk about. Everybody in my book, and my book is basically written by the survivors, is all in their own words. And the American liberating soldiers. It's all in their own words with my commentary of the book. They tell you the stories too. Okay, so to back it up a little bit, you can study the Holocaust, as I have, for many, many years. I started by studying World War II. But I opened this door when I talked to Red Walsh, and he led me into this room where there were 12 other doors to go through. And once I stepped through one door, there was another 12 doors that I had to pass through. In the study of the Holocaust, you go down all these, I don't want to call them rabbit holes, but you learn how much you don't know. And the more you realize, the more it blows your mind. You know, what I would say to the kids is, 6 million, can you even picture what 1 million looks like? Of course you can. Okay, now think about murdering those people over the course of 4.5 years. How does that happen? And who's responsible for it? Everybody says Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. Sure, he had a lot to do with it, but I got to tell you something. The roots of the hatred were there long before Adolf Hitler was even born. He was an administrator. How many people did he kill with his own hands? How many triggers did he pull? The answer is none. Oh, don't forget, 1.5 of those 6 million people were murdered by bullets, not gas chambers. Gas chambers began because the bullets were not efficient enough. How are the people freed on the train? A snapshot of European Jewry persecuted by the Nazis and others. That was a challenge for me. Most of them were Hungarian Jews, but there were Polish Jews on that train, Dutch Jews, German Jews, even Greek Jews. Every single one of them had a different element that they brought to the story. How can I make people care about this story? Well, you need to listen to the stories plural. And And why is it important to listen to these people? What's going to happen when they're no longer with us? Because most of them aren't. Once people have absorbed the stories, do they have a moral responsibility to act on the lessons? In other words, why am I having this conversation with you? Why am I trying to teach young people about the Holocaust? The leading historian, Yehudi Baruch, in Yad Vashem, he said, you want to know what the big lesson of the Holocaust is? The answer is there are no lessons. Everybody takes the Holocaust and they say, well, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but yes, we need to teach the lesson about what happened in the past so it doesn't happen again. But the Holocaust was not bullying gone wild. The Holocaust started with words. It turned into something entirely different. Is there such a thing as being a witness when you yourself were not there? I'm going to argue yes. I was born 16 years after World War II ended. But in 2003, I went here. This is the camp that the train transport I'm going to tell you about tonight originated from. This is a camp. I'll show you some slides of it today and slides of it in 1945. If you didn't see the big monument here or the memorials, you would think you were in a state park. There's Bergen-Belsen, that's circled in the green. The red dots, you can imagine, are concentration camps, right? Most of the biggest red dots are located in which country, the big ones? They're in Poland, because that's where 3.3 out of 7 million European Jews lived. So this is where the major death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, for example, that's where the quote-unquote extermination camps were. I hate that word. Extermination. These people weren't pests, but these were murder centers. They were killing factories. Bergen-Belsen had an entirely different history. It actually started as a Soviet prisoner of war camp, and it evolved into something much different because of where it was located. It was far away from the advancing Soviet Red Armies when many people were shipped there in the winter of 1944-45. This map shows you, the date on it is April 18th. I stole from the World War II Museum in New Orleans. You can see the advancing Western Allies. They're closing in on Berlin, and of course the Russians are coming in the other direction, the Red Army. They've already liberated a long time ago in January 45. They liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Germans tried to destroy some of the evidence of the other major death camps, death centers. A lot of these folks were being death marched. By the time you got to mid-April, when the story takes place, millions and millions and millions of people were on the move. The British, on April 15, 1945, crashed through the gates of Bergen-Belsen. Actually, as they were advancing on the camp Bergen-Belsen, the Germans surrendered the camp, but they said, look, we have to set some parameters here. We're not just going to open the gates because you're going to have a mess on your hands when you come through. Indeed, there were 60,000 people in the camp, almost all of them sick, starving, emaciated, lice-ridden. And the British put this sign up sometime later in 1945, and it's true. Everything on here is factually accurate. 10,000 unburied dead were found here on April 15, 1945. Another 13,000 have since died, all been victims of the German New Order in Europe. 800 people died on the day the British came into the camp. 1 week before, 3 transports left Bergen-Belsen. One of these was liberated by the Americans at a place called Farsleben near the town of Magdeburg, the city, hence a train near Magdeburg. This memorial was erected just 1 year after Bergen-Belsen was liberated. The people who put this monument here were the Jewish community who lived here. Many of the people who survived Bergen-Belsen, including some of my friends who were on the train near Magdeburg, they wound up back where they were incarcerated in Bergen-Belsen. because there was nowhere for them to go. It became a displaced persons camp. I know some of my friends were there for 5 years after the war behind the barbed wire before they could be allowed to emigrate to places like Canada or the United States or even Israel. Here is some kind of a graveyard. You can see some of the barracks building in the back, because before it was a, there still is up on this plain in northwestern Germany, a German army base. Okay, so it was also an army base, and those barracks were where some of the survivors lived after the war. I know that all of these people died long after the liberation. How do I know that? I went there, I saw the diorama. It's a beautiful place. This brand new museum actually opened up right around the time we did our first reunion in Hudson Falls in 2007. Like I said, it's like walking through a park. There's no building standing here. Original from 1945. This is some of my group. Now some of these pictures I'm going to show you next are from 1945, so that's one of them. And this is a few, I would say, less than a week after liberation. This is what my friends who were on this train, these young kids, had to walk past as they were getting on this train called, train headed to another camp. They became used to it. Death. These are pools where people would bathe. They would get their drinking water. They got sick here, cholera, etc. Here's a photograph nearby showing part of the women's camp. And this is, you know, after liberation. British Army photographs. Beautiful stroll through the woods. Here's a Dutch boy in about the same place in 1945. That's me taking my little walk, thinking, what's here? You could feel the evil there. A drainage ditch through the woods. That's 1945. About the same area, I would think. There's the ditch. He's dead. This is German. It says 800 tot, 800 dead. But what do you do with 10,000 unburied dead? You have to put them in the ground. It's a mass grave. Any idea who she is? Very good. It's Margot Frank. Her sister, we know who she is. The Dyer being Frank. Anne and Margot died about 3 weeks before liberation. And they're not buried there. I can guarantee you that. They're buried somewhere in here. I don't linger on those slides. But anytime you see a grave that's open like that, or you see a British soldier pushing a bulldozer, driving a bulldozer, pushing corpses, that's Bergen-Belsen. 1,000 dead. This is danger typhus. These guys in these army carriers, the speed limit was 5 miles an hour because they couldn't have the clouds of dust carrying the typhus, very highly infectious. This is what killed a lot of people. Typhus is borne by lice. Here's a drawing done by a guy who was actually on the train, Herman Abadi. He was a Hungarian Jew. He sketched like a madman at Hillersleben after he was liberated. This is the nightmare that the Americans had to confront with these people who were dying on them after they liberated the train. Typhus. So why are there no buildings? What flag do we see flying there? The British burnt the entire place to the ground because of the infection, the disease. There's nothing there today. I know some of the teachers I was with on this very emotional trip, they were angry. They were crying. Because there's nothing tangible to remind people about what happened here, except these mass graves that look like mounted over football fields. But you can feel it, like I said. So, I finally got to get to Bergen-Belsen. I met a German historian that I had been corresponding with for years, and in the background you can see my photograph. It's not mine. It's in the National Archives because a U.S. soldier took it, but my friends told me about it, and I was the one who helped bring it to light. He used them and he saw my webpage. His name is Bernd Horstman. He is the custodian of the Book of Names. Now, do you remember I told you, well, how do you know 6 million? You have to literally count individual people, and okay, 120,000 inmates passed through Bergen-Belsen. Not all of them were killed there or died there. But he's the guy who has to reconstruct these lists. Okay, the Germans were meticulous record keepers. Remember Schindler's List? This train had a manifest list too. They counted all the people. His job is to rebuild it because the Germans destroyed everything they could before they turned the camp over to the Allies. And his book, he gave me a copy of 2 volumes. There's 55,000 names in it. He's not even halfway through it. He's been working for years. But people come to him and say, can you tell me about when I was a little kid here? And he's the one that says, you need to go to his website. So that's how a lot of these reunions came about. Okay, now I am going to give the floor over to the Liberator, Carol Walsh, and he's speaking with an interviewer who interviewed him for National Public Radio back in 2009, actually. He's going to tell you the story the day he found the train. And the other person, actually the one who starts the story, is survivor Steve Berry. He was a Hungarian Jew. He was 20 years old at the time of the liberation, so he remembers everything almost like he had a photographic memory. He had no parents to look after. His father had already been killed. I think his mother survived back in Hungary. He had no children. He had no wife. So he was a survivor. He was lucky, and he knew it. But he remembered the exact moment when these 2 tanks came about. He got very interested in finding his liberators. When he saw that newspaper article, he knew how to get a hold, well, he got a hold of us, and we put him in touch with Walsh, okay? So just listen to this, and it's basically the story of, from each perspective, what this day meant, but it's also 62 years later when they met again, and the message that the American soldier has for everybody on the planet. Okay, so he's going to tell you that the train is now stopped near the city of Magdeburg. They're bound for Theresienstadt. I told you there were 3 trains. One of them made it to Theresienstadt. This was the last concentration camp to be freed on May 8th, the last day of the war by the Russians. These people they had some value. You notice you didn't see them in the photographs with the typical striped pajama concentration camp type uniform. They were allowed to wear their own clothes. They had special value to the Germans. A lot of it had to do with some kind of documents in their possessions that would make them valuable to another country. So they were literally bargaining chips. There were 3 trains, 6,700 total. 1 train made it here. The lucky train on Friday the 13th was liberated by the Americans. Another train for 2 weeks on the other side of the Elbe River was liberated by the Russians. So Steve Berry's going to tell you about the liberation.
Steve Berry went back into the passenger car on the train to sleep that night. The next morning, he saw that Nazi soldiers had come back.
Mounted SS troops came around, rode by the train, and started to yell, "Raus, raus, get out of the train, get out of the cars." And we saw them putting up machine gun nests. So obviously, even at that last moment, they were still trying to murder us.
Where were you at the time? Were you still in the passenger car?
I was still in the passenger car, and no way would I have gotten out of there. In other words, if they wanted to kill me, they had to come into the car and shoot me.
But there were windows there. I mean, they could see you in there, right?
They could see me in there, of course. But see, it's a huge, I don't know how many railroad cars was needed to contain 2,500 people, but you know, it's a long line of railroad cars. It was, I mean, the only thing they could have done at that point is probably just keep shooting, but it just didn't make much sense even to them. So when they saw that nobody was getting out of the car, they just packed up and rode away. Very short while later, they came back again in the opposite direction. My friends and I says, uh-oh, we know what's going on. We are surrounded. These guys can't get out because they went from left to right and they just disappeared. So we were absolutely right, because very shortly after that, we saw the first American GIs.
And were they in trucks or tanks? What did you see?
Well, actually, there were 2 tanks. I still get tears in my eyes. That's what it was. Right now, I have tears in my eyes. And I always will when I think about it.
That was the moment that you knew you were safe?
That we knew that we were safe. And we were sitting, we found some matches in those German soldiers' cars. So we had this tiny little fire going, and we were sitting next to it, and I was sitting there with this great big SS overcoat on, and one GI walked down the embankment, came over to the fire, sat next to me, took out his penknife, and he cut off the SS insignia from my coat and slowly dumped it into the fire. And if my voice breaks up right now, it always does when I say that, because it's a moment that is just never be forgotten. I don't know who the GI was, but it was something that, it just signaled something to me that maybe I'm safe. And maybe the war ended and the Germans or the Nazis are defeated.
What a symbol.
It was an unbelievable symbol to me, and all I can tell you is it still touches me very deeply, and probably always will.
A 24-year-old American soldier, Sergeant Carol Walsh, was commanding one of those tanks. He remembers the day they came upon that train near Magdeburg, as much as he remembers anything from those endless days of fighting.
Tired? I never thought about being tired. I can't explain that. You just didn't. You just kept going. I can't explain that to you. You just kept going. You didn't feel anything much.
You remember seeing the train the first time?
Oh, sure. I remember coming upon the train.
Did you know at the time that these were prisoners or had been prisoners, or that you know, they'd been held? But did you have any idea what they were doing there?
No, I had no idea. I had no idea who they were, where they had come from, where they were going. Nothing. No idea. All I knew, there's a train with these boxcars and people jammed in those boxcars. No idea.
Steve Barry knew, as one of the young Hungarian Jews who'd been trapped on that train, that their luck had finally changed.
The Americans were totally unbelievable, because there is no other army in this world that would stop and help 2,500 lice-ridden, emaciated Jews to save them. What army would stop except the American army? I mean, this is a shooting war. I mean, these guys could have gotten shot 10 minutes later. The 30th Division stopped.
Did they have any food for you?
Whatever they had on them, and you know, it was mostly a chocolate bar or a cracker or whatever the K ration contained, yeah, or chewing gum, they immediately gave it to us. And then later on, they arranged for food and transportation to get us out.
I'm Dick Gordon. You're listening to The Story. Errol Walsh was one tired soldier when the Americans discovered the train of camp survivors. And they were still under orders to rout the remains of the Nazi soldiers, so they had a problem.
What are we going to do with these people? How can we handle this situation? Fortunately, there was another attached unit with the 30th Division. They were in the area. That battalion immediately went around the neighborhood there getting food from the local farmers and bringing it to the people, and then overnight or the next day, there were other units that arrived to assist these people and find shelter for them.
It may be a silly question to ask, you know, from this one moment, whether or not it stuck in your mind, but in the years after the war, did you ever think of that day when you came upon that train?
Not very much, no.
Yeah.
No, it was because it was just another day, you might say.
Yeah.
I don't mean to put that down or minimize
I
what was
understand
going on
yeah,
with these people, but it was just another incident, another day, and on you went. No, I didn't think about it much through the years, and I didn't really think much about it until I had this interview with Matt Rozell, the history teacher in Hudson Falls, New York High School. My daughter said, "Why don't you tell him about that train?" I hadn't thought even to mention the train to Matt Rozell, and I did. And as a result of that, that's how a lot of the programs and the connections with the survivors has come about.
Carol Walsh talks about the high school history teacher, Matt Rozell. In teaching about the Second World War, Matt invited veterans in to speak to his students. Well, that led to a website and eventually to an event, a reunion, that included both veterans and survivors. Carol Walsh was there.
It was quite emotional. You know what I said to them?
What's that?
Long time no see.
Only 62 years.
Yeah, that's all. It was quite emotional.
Yeah,
now they were the ones that I have met were very young on the train. A couple of them were, I think, teenagers, but for the most part they were children.
But you said it was emotional. I mean, I can understand why it was emotional for them. You guys, whether you knew it or not, were the saviors and the heroes. But
well, let me stop there. No, not heroes. It all came about. It just so happened that Gross and I were the ones that our tanks were assigned to this particular scouting trip. Yes, those people look upon us as saviors. I don't know why. I don't feel like that. If you can understand my feeling, I don't. Yes, it came about. Because we got there. Yes. At that particular time, those SS guards took off, and it was the end of their ordeal. There's no question about that.
I mean, if you weren't the sole hero who saved them, and nobody's suggesting that's the case, you and the other tank commander, you were the symbols of their liberation.
Exactly. That's a good expression. That's a good description. Symbols. Yes, indeed. Yes.
And so if it was in a way just another day in battle for you, when you say that your reunions have been emotional, why are they emotional for you?
It's emotional for me when I think of where they were headed. They were headed to another concentration camp and extermination, and I get emotional now because I know what they went through. And what it meant to them that we happened to intercept that train at that time. They're real people. When I look back, they were almost not like real people when I first encountered them on the train, on the cars. They were just a large group, 2,500 figures.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, they have names. They had lives. They had families. They have stories. I guess that's why I find it emotional.
The Associated Press published an article about the reunion of survivors and liberators of that train beside Magdeburg. And that was the article that Steve Barry read. He'd been there. He'd been waiting a very long time to thank someone. And so he called up the high school history teacher and found out that Carol Walsh lived just a few hours away from him in Florida.
And I was just so anxious to hug somebody that was liberating that train that I just couldn't wait to meet with Carol. I called Carol and I explained to him who I was. And I said, you know, I just have to come to you and I have to hug you. And he said, anytime, just please do come.
Steve Barry will never forget that meeting. He brought with him 2 daughters and a son-in-law.
We called on a cell phone. We called his home on a cell phone, said that we are almost around the corner from you. So when we drove up, the 5 of us drove up to the door, Carol was already outside.
Was it an emotional moment for you?
Unbelievable. It still is. It just never went away. And I walked over to him and we just embraced each other, right in front of his house. I have all the pictures of that moment. And then we went inside and we met his wife, Dorothy. She's a very lovely person. But for some strange coincidence, or maybe it wasn't, we connected immediately. It's like we became true friends in a matter of a half hour and stayed that way. I call him on the phone, I exchange emails with him.
It's such an amazing thing that our lives were joined at that moment on April 13, 1945. All the years have gone by since. We've had lives, families, jobs, whatever. Here we are, and now we meet face to face and recall together that moment when my tank reached the train.
You know, I kept calling him my liberator. He says, I'm really not your liberator. It was my job. I just happened to be there. I said, I don't care what you tell me, you're my liberator.
I actually have here in my studio, Steve, a copy of a letter that he wrote to you. And if you don't mind, I'll just read a couple of sentences. This is Carol writing to you, and he says, you're always expressing gratitude to me, to the 743rd Tank Battalion and the 30th Infantry Division. But I don't believe that gratitude is deserved, because we were doing what we and the whole world should have been doing, rescuing and protecting innocent people from being killed, murdered by vicious criminals. You don't owe us, we owe you. We can never repay you and the Jewish people of Europe for what was stolen from you, your homes, your possessions, your businesses, your money, your art, your family life, your families, your childhood, your dreams, and all your lives.
Is this a beautiful person? You know, when I got the letter, I said, you know, I just can't possibly keep this letter to myself. I asked him if I have his permission to give this letter to some other people to read it, and he said it's okay.
That's right. I can't believe today, as I look back on those years and what was happening, I can't believe that the world almost ignored those people in what was happening. I can't believe it. How could we have all stood by and have let that happen? We owe those people a great deal. We owe those people everything. They don't owe us anything. We owe them for what we allowed to happen to them. That's how I feel.
Those are my 2 buddies. Hope you're your buddies now, too. Carol died in December of 2012. He died in Florida. He hated the cold. He always went to Florida for the winter time because he froze nearly to death in his tank during the Battle of the Bulge. He just could not stand the cold. And I remember I called him up because I knew it was going to be our last conversation. He was kind of weak, but he was still trying to crack jokes. And what do you do when you know your friend's dying and this is your last phone conversation? I started talking about the weather, of course. I said, it's really cold up here in New York. He started chuckling a little bit. He said, I hope it's cold where I'm going. Yeah, he passed a few days later. Literally 2 or 3 weeks after he died, Steve died. He had a car accident. Actually, it was the January before. And he lingered for a while, and he passed away. But I'm glad you got to hear their stories. George Gross, the other liberator, actually died on my son's birthday in 2009. I never met him. I was going to fly out to California because he didn't like to fly. But I never got the chance. But his son came to all these reunions. And we recently interviewed his son for the new film coming out. Yeah, so these are all my good buddies. And I really think this is an important story. And they aired it on Memorial Day in 2009. It was called The Story with Dick Gordon on National Public Radio out of North Carolina. But it was a nationwide thing. And it became their most requested play this again thing. I think this is in the days before podcasts. They should re-release it. I really feel strongly about that. Especially when they talk about this letter and the depth of where it came from in Carol Walsh's soul to actually, he was angry. He was angry that people were calling him a liberator and a hero. And he said, almost like, how dare people do that? Wow. How could this have happened? Because he learned a lot about the Holocaust through all this experience that we had together. And yeah, what he said. So I gave this presentation to a group of people whose job it was to move the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum forward, like their top development people. And the director of the museum, Sarah Bloomfield, who is still there today. This is about 10 years ago. It was 2010. I played this little video, and I can remember some of the higher up people were looking at their watches saying, oh my God, is this thing ever going to end? They were doing it because they had to get on to some other business. And I said, hold your horses. Listen to what he has to say. And Mrs. Bloomfield stood up at the end. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to her top brass, and she said, you people get that letter for the museum. Meaning, try and get Judge Walsh's letter, try and get Steve Berry to donate it, and they did. So it's in the archives of the Holocaust Museum. It's that important. I don't know if it's on display, but you got to hear it being read. Anyway, profound thing, something I like to bring out, especially when students are in the audience. This is our 2009 reunion. This short, lovely young lady, she's alive still. She's Ariella Rojic. She was, I think, 12 years old at Liberation time. She saw herself in one of the photographs because she recognized a sweater that she made from threads of worn blankets in Bergen-Belsen. She lives in Toronto. Paul Arado recently passed away. He was 6 when he was liberated with his mom and his older brother. His father is dead. He carried a lot of anger his entire life. He had definite PTSD, anger management, as you can imagine, right? But he said this really helped him heal. Fred lives in New Jersey. He would come up to the high school quite a bit. And Elizabeth, she was actually from Holland too. So anyway, pretty cool stuff. Other major people, I only have a few slides left, but I want to introduce you to them. Frank Towers. Remember I told you about Saturday, April 14th, the morning after the liberation. He showed up so that George Gross could leave with his tank and go fight the battle. Frank's job was to bring these people to an abandoned German Air Force base that had just been captured by the Americans. It had hospitals there. It had German doctors and nurses. And it had barracks buildings. So that's where these people wound up, about 10 miles away. Frank's job was to get them there. Frank became the secretary of this project. He was the one who tracked down hundreds of these people on his own. And of course, he was greeted as a hero. He went to Israel. I went with him. He met 55 old people who at one time were young children on this train. And the auditorium we met him in was filled with 550 people. Probably most of them wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for the Americans coming on to site when they did. So you can imagine, he was there for 2 weeks, and he met everybody in Israel. Like he went up to the Israeli IDF, the Israeli Army Chief of Staff. He got a special tour. I went to Yad Vashem with him. He was treated like a king. When I was studying at Yad Vashem, he passed away at age 99. Leslie Meisel's, my other good buddy, that's him at age 17, actually younger, but he was liberated at age 17. He's holding his revenge. That's his granddaughter. He was from Toronto. He would speak to young people all the time. He died almost a year ago right now. And I spoke to his widow. She called me up. I keep in touch with all these people still. Just like 2 weeks ago. He was a great man. Don't let my past become your future was his story with the young people. This little girl was 3 years old. Her mother died in Bergen-Belsen. Her father was already dead. She was adopted by Jewish women who didn't know who she was. Her memory of Bergen-Belsen is mud, and when the women cut all of her hair off her head because of the lice issue. And she wound up in Israel after the war. She heard about me, and she came to the United States. This is taken up on Lake George on one of the steamboats. She's a great lady. One of the top dancers in Israel for her career. And she's a Tai Chi master. She wields a sword, so you better watch out. Beautiful. Getting to the end here, this is Mr. Walter Gans. Just when I thought I would never hear from another American soldier, because 4 years went by and I hadn't heard from anybody. After our last reunion at the high school in Hudson Falls in 2011, the secretaries had a phone put into my room. I mean, the school district put a phone in my room with a line to the outside world, because the secretaries, I think, everybody knows they're the real bosses in the building anyway. They were getting phone calls from all over the place, people wanting to talk to me. So they put a phone in my room. The phone rang during one of my free periods. I picked it up, and it was this guy. He said, "Matt Rozell, God bless you." He lives down in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He's still alive. In fact, I talked to him yesterday. His name is Walter Gans. Walter was one of the people who took care of these folks at Hillersleben, the hospital. He said, "Matt, I know a bunch of other guys who were there with me." So we interviewed him, and this guy lives down in the Bronx. His name is Luca Ferrari, pretty good shape. He was telling the story of this little girl at the Hillersleben camp. Here's her picture. Okay, typical of the children who were on the train, liberated. She didn't look too healthy, does she? Well, her mother begged Luca and his friends, these American GIs, to take this little girl home. They kind of like adopted her, would bring her food, and finally the mother said, "Take her to America, please, please." They had nowhere to go. Luca, they actually worked out a scheme. They put the girl in one of the GI duffel bags, but her head was sticking out. So it wouldn't work. They're going to go on ship with her when it's time to go home. So with my help, we're looking for this girl. Her name's Irene. That's about all we know right now. We've been looking for years. It'd be great to find her. Okay, so I told you about the film, and this is going to wrap up my presentation. Yeah, we've been working on this film for about 4 years, and last spring we finished up our second trailer for it. This is what you call a pre-production trailer. In other words, the whole film's not made yet. We're trying to raise funds. We have a lot of irons in the fire. It will happen for sure. I want it to happen by this time next year, because it'll be the 75th anniversary of the liberation. Next week, my friend Mike Edwards, who's making the film, and I are traveling to Scranton. I've never met Walter in my life, believe it or not. It's been 8 years of conversations on the phone. We're going to Scranton because we found a new Holocaust survivor, a man who's 80 years old, and he's traveling with his daughter from Pittsburgh to Scranton, and we're going to meet at a restaurant a week from today. It's going to be all filmed. It's going to be, I hope it's going to be pretty dramatic. You may have heard of the survivor. His name is Judas Samet, if it's not ringing a bell. He was present at the horrible massacre in October at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. If you read the accounts, he was the survivor who pulled in just as the gunman was emerging from the synagogue, still firing rounds. And he witnessed it. And I saw the Washington Post article, and I realized he was on this train. So I called him. I actually found his daughter first, called him up. She's going to bring him to Pittsburgh to meet Walter Gans. And Walter said, you'll see him talk in this little trailer. He said, Matt, for 40 years of reunions, when we got together, we talked about things that, you know, they were medics in the Battle of the Bulge, guys with their legs blown off, okay? They talked about this, but we would never talk about what happened at Hillersleeve because the stress, the post-traumatic stuff hit them too. Very hard. They were caring for young people like this girl, Irene, got very attached to these little girls and boys who would then die on them. So they never talked about it. So I know Judah's father died at Hillersleeve. So we'll see how that meeting goes. I'm pretty excited about it. Anyway, here's Walter. Here's our trailer. You'll see some of the people I just introduced talking again. And then I'll tell you about my books. And ask if you have any questions, okay?
A long time ago, over 70 years. It's a lifetime. Sadly, at time your memories become dimmed, You just can't. But there are certain events that will stay with a person all their lifetime.
We seem to be wrapping up our conversation, and I was about to turn the camera off. And Carol Walsh's daughter, who was present in the background, said, "Dad, did you tell Mr. Rozell about that train?" And he thought for a minute, he said, "No, I didn't."
He had photographs that George had taken and Major Benjamin had taken. My father kept copies of those in his top dresser drawer from the time of the war to pretty much to the end. And I look back on that now and I think how unusual. Everything else about the war was put away. He didn't talk about the war very much, and yet those pictures were something that must have touched him very deeply.
Searching for gun positions, and all of a sudden I was attracted by this terrible odor, and we couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I mean, I was in a state of shock. I never saw anything so bad in my life.
He heard lower than animals. We were not having names. We were not considered to be human beings. We were treated like creatures whose destiny should be death.
I kept asking my mother, are they shooting yet? And I went to the death gap, and again I saw, and they went beautiful.
Oh God, we are free.
Go to my website, you can watch it again, it's up there tonight. And there's a place if anybody is interested in helping us bring it to fruition. We have meetings with some pretty important people coming up. I'm sure it'll get made because it's an important story. And I hope you like the trailer. Website. Right now I'm talking to a bunch of kids, school kids in Germany who are actually going to school right near the liberation site. One girl, her English is fantastic. She is only 16, but she's trying to find this Greek survivor who apparently one of the German townspeople, a girl at the time, became close with in the 5 or 6 weeks that these people were on site. I don't think we're going to find him. He's probably dead, but you never know. So I'm trying to help her out here. You never know what's going to happen. So anyway, that's the website. I do have a Facebook author page. It's a good way for people to see what's going on if they're on Facebook. Get the story out. My first book was on the war in the Pacific. Interviews with men and women from Pearl Harbor all the way through Hiroshima, Tokyo Bay. Second, actually this is my second book. This is the book I had to get out of me before it killed me. I mean, it almost killed me writing this book because it's a very personal story too. I literally wound up in the hospital right before school started in 2016. I think it was exhaustion, but it was it's one of those things I was like a maniac. I had to get it done. The Things Our Fathers Saw, Volume 2. This is a series. This could be book. Yeah, this is Volume 2. It's on the guys who were in the heavy bombers flying over Europe. Pretty incredible stories. There's actually Volume 3 is a swimmer volume. Same thing, but a lot of prisoner of war guys who got shot down. Volume 4 came out this summer. It's on the war in North Africa and Italy, up the bloody boot. It's all the world history told by the guys who actually lived it, saw these things. Nobody knows anything about this war, but that's not tonight's talk. Maybe some other time. My next book, which I hope is out this summer, is going to be on D-Day in Normandy. I think there's going to be about 8 books in this series by the time I'm done. So that's how I keep busy as a retired guy. I wrote these 2 while I was still teaching. I do have them here tonight. Any book you want is $20, $30 in hardcover. I got those too. And the more you buy, the more you save. So I just throw that out there. But after tonight's talk, are there any questions or things that you want me to clarify? Yes, sir.
There's a suggestion that, like the soldiers, very surprising to discover the horrors of what was going on.
Yeah.
And my question to you, what's your take on what the knowledge of what was going on for several years, considering the level of participation, not just
stories are there. Whether or not people wanted to believe them or act on them was another thing. There's no question that higher-ups in the U.S. government, they were aware to a certain extent of what was going on. But the actual magnitude, if you're not there with your own eyes, it's hard to believe it, okay? There are people who, for example, escaped from Auschwitz, and the message got back to the United States of America and to the higher-ups in Britain, etc. But, you know, not to excuse that behavior, but the American military, there's a lot of arguments about, well, why didn't the U.S. Air Force bomb Auschwitz, the railroad tracks going to Auschwitz? And that's a legitimate question, because it could have been done towards the end of the war. But it wasn't a military target. Even though there were slave labor, war material factories attached to the Auschwitz complex. The whole thing from the American military perspective was, our job is to get this war done. And priorities and resources, okay? You think about these things. Not to excuse any of that, but I guess to kind of answer your question, people knew. The American public, the Holocaust Museum has a great online exhibition right now called Americans in the Holocaust. What did the ordinary average you and me Americans know about the Holocaust as it was unfolding? The technical definition of the Holocaust, it begins in 1933 when Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. And oh, by the way, he doesn't seize power by force, does he? He is democratically elected, okay? And these things unfold. Well, how does this happen? So if you read the newspaper accounts in the New York Times, Kristallnacht is in there, front and center on every major American newspaper in 1938. The Germans, the Jews of Germany, they can't get out. Okay, so you know, you get all kinds of really good questions from students and other people. Well, why didn't they just leave? Well, you know what? Not too many other countries opened their doors, for one thing. There was one ship called the St. Louis that tried to get into Cuba, then Florida. It was turned back with 900 people on it. A quarter of the people on that boat, when it returned to Europe, I think it was somewhere in Holland, were murdered in the Holocaust. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but the things that Red Walsh was talking about in his letter, he's outraged. He's pissed off. You know, how dare you call me a hero when we didn't do anything about it? So, I mean, my whole argument is, here's these ordinary American boys. That's not their job, but they did something. And again, with military resources, the government, the Army, made the decision to do that. There were some Red Army camps that were liberated. These Red Army soldiers kept flying. They didn't stop to do this. So, anyway. Any other questions?
I might have misunderstood you in the beginning when you were talking about when you were making this, when you were writing this book, you said it was in 4 parts.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. My whole thing was, okay, I'm going to write a book about really my experience in learning about the Holocaust as an American teacher. And I have some things that I want to share, like what Carol Walsh said, what all these survivors went through. But how do I tell such a story of that magnitude with all these people that I know from all over Europe? So I really decided, and who's my audience, you know? I want to work on a young adult edition, because that book is 500 pages long. Who's my audience? The person who doesn't know anything about the Holocaust. I want them to learn so much about the Holocaust. And if you read the reviews on Amazon, I think I'm hitting the target there, okay? So I want to teach about the Holocaust. I don't want to make it too general so that the person who knows a little bit more, I want everybody to learn something, come away with something from the book. So the first third of the book is about the story of the Holocaust as it unfolds, starting in Poland with the invasion. What happens to this little Polish girl in her town? What happens to her home? She's placed in a ghetto. How does she wind up in Bergen-Belsen? So I take the Polish thing. Then I talk about what happened in Germany, Kristallnacht, etc., with my German Jews, their experience. Then I take it to Hungary. Hungary was the last country invaded defeated by the Germans because they were quasi-friends with the Germans for most of the war until they changed their tune in March of 1944. The Germans invaded on March 18th, and between the end of March and the beginning of July 1944, 450,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered at Auschwitz. It was cranking. 25,000 people a day were being murdered in that murder factory. And my friends who were Hungarians, which most of the people on this train, were significantly lucky. A lot of them had a similar story. They were heading straight towards Auschwitz, but some partisans blew the rails out. And they diverted the train up through Austria, where they wound up doing some slave labor on farms, so little kids could work too. And then, towards the end of the war, towards Bergen-Belsen, and they were in a special camp there. So it was a miracle, you know. And Leslie Meisels explains this really well in the book. He wrote his own book, which I pirated in my book. The parts, he says there were 3 miracles in my life. The first one when the partisans blew up the train to Auschwitz, or the tracks to Auschwitz. The second one where we had a choice to get on another train. One of them went straight to Auschwitz, the other was head to Austria. His mother wanted to get on the train because the other family members were getting on this other train. They don't know where it's going. Let's go with Aunt so-and-so. And this 17-year-old kid who never disobeyed his mother, you don't talk back to your mother in some of these families in Europe. He said, no, you're coming with me. And they got on this train that wound up in Bergen-Belsen. That was a second miracle. His third miracle was the day that he met his liberators at our high school. He was very profoundly moved by that. So to answer your question, I talk about that I talk about the Holocaust, then I talk about the American soldiers and what they went through. That's a good chunk of the book. And then when they meet, okay, what that day was like, and then our reunion. So there's 4 parts.
When did you want to first start writing? This comes down later in life.
Well, I think when I heard the first reunions, I interviewed these guys in 2001 and 2002. When I started to hear from the grandmother and others about 4 or 5 years later, I knew I had to do something with it, especially after the reunions, and I saw the students' reactions, but I wasn't ready. I was totally unready for it. Anyway, I could add another chapter to it, but maybe I'll save it for another book. Well, I want to thank you for coming out tonight. And,
that was wonderful.
And it is an amazing book. I've read it. Very, very powerful book. Powerful story.
I'll see you tomorrow night. He did deliver the mishloach for notes, so that was nice. Yes.